There's a kind of quiet courage that doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself or ask for a thing. You find it in a woman who steps off a stagecoach in a town that doesn't know her name and walks straight past every curious eye toward a piece of the land she's never stood on. She has a plan drawn on paper, money enough for nails and cornmeal, and a bone-deep determination never to depend on another living soul again. This is a story about what happens when that kind of stubbornness meets a man who has already quit on living. Neither of them saw it coming. The rope cut into both palms before she'd moved the log 20 feet. Clara Holt didn't stop. She reset her grip, dug her boot heels into the dry Kansas dirt, and pulled. The pine log didn't care that she was one woman. It didn't care that she was 32 years old and had arrived in Harrow Creek 3 days ago with one bag and a deed folded inside her dress. It didn't care that not a single soul in this territory knew her name before last Tuesday. Neither did the sun. It hammered down on her shoulders without apology. From somewhere north of the fence line, a fence she hadn't thought to look past a horse stopped walking. She didn't hear it stop. She wouldn't have looked up anyway. If this story feels like someone you once knew, that quiet, stubborn kind of grit that built this country one hammer swing at a time, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your hometown below. Home is where the work is, as the old folks used to say. The log moved another 6 inches. Then it stopped. Clara's boots had no more ground to push against. The dirt behind her left heel had crumbled into loose soil, and her right knee was shaking, not from fear, she told herself, from the angle, from the weight, from the fact that a pine log 3 feet longer than she was tall had no particular reason to cooperate with anyone. She dropped the rope, stood straight, pressed both fists into the small of her back, and looked at the sky for exactly the time it took to breathe twice. The man whose name had been on the contract, Elias Forder, a wheat farmer outside Harrow Creek, had died of a fever the February before she arrived. She'd gotten the letter in Ohio in March. By then, she'd already sold the furniture she'd built, already given notice on the room she rented above the milliner's shop. The land deed had cost her most of what she had left, and she'd signed it with the same pen she'd used to write back to the agency, saying she wouldn't be needing their services any further. She crouched back down and studied the problem. The log had settled into a shallow rut, one end lower than the other. She'd been pulling the heavy end the whole time. Simple as that. Stupid as that. She repositioned the rope, looped it 8 inches closer to the lighter end, retied the knot with the method her father had shown her when she was 9 years old. Her hands remembered it before her mind did. The loop sat clean and tight. She pulled. The log came, not fast, not easy, but it came, and she walked it backward the full 30 yards to where she'd driven the corner stakes that first morning. The sweat on her collar had soaked through twice over. Her calico dress smelled like pine resin and turned earth. She let the rope go slack and stood at the edge of her staked plot. She was reading the third line of her plan when she noticed the shadow. Not on the paper. On the ground. Long, thin at the top. The unmistakable shape of a man on horseback, thrown 30 feet across the grass from somewhere north of her stakes. She hadn't heard a horse approach. She hadn't heard anything at all. The shadow moved before Clara did. She kept her eyes on the plan. The pencil lines were faint in the afternoon glare, and she needed to finish reading the third measurement before the light shifted any further. She read it, folded the paper against her thigh. Then she turned around. The man on horseback was 30 yards north of her stakes. On the far side of the split-rail fence, she'd noticed her first morning and paid no attention to since. He had dismounted. He was crouched at one of the posts with a hand tool. She couldn't tell what from this distance, working the base of the post in the deliberate way of a man who needs to appear occupied. The bay horse stood ground-tied to nothing, reins dropped in the grass, an animal trained to stay. Clara looked at him for 3 full seconds. He did not look up. She turned back to her timber and picked up her mallet. The brace gave way on the second course. She heard it before she felt it, a dry, splitting crack that moved up through the wood the way a fault line finds its path. The diagonal support she'd hand-cut from a length of green pine buckled at the shoulder joint, and the half-raised wall frame swung away from her in a long, deliberate arc and came down against the ground with a sound like a flat hand on a hard table. Dust lifted, settled. Clara stood with the mallet still raised. She set it down against her boot. Then she sat on the fallen frame, on the timber itself, and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and looked at the Kansas sky without seeing it. She counted. She'd done this before in a different state, in a different year, in a kitchen that no longer belonged to her. You counted because counting kept everything else out. 1, 2, 3. The sun sat fixed overhead, somewhere in the grass to her left. Something small moved and stopped. 12, 19, 24. At 60, she stood up. Her knees had gone stiff from the ground. She rolled her right ankle twice against the resistance of her boot leather and let the last of the count go. She examined the joint. The pine had been too green, she'd known that when she cut it. The fiber had split along the grain, which meant the failure wasn't at the cut itself. She'd given it load before it had anything to brace against. A loading problem, not a cutting problem. She pulled the failed piece free and set it aside. The rest of the joint had held. One piece lost. Not the wall. Mrs. Peck's general store was cool and smelled of burlap, dried herbs, and the particular dusty sweetness of flour barrels kept out of the sun. Clara spread her hand-drawn plan on the counter without preamble. "The brace joint," she said. "What's the right way to set it so it carries load before the wall is fully upright?" Mrs. Peck looked at the drawing. She did not look at Clara. She turned the paper slightly, then turned it back and placed one finger on the corner. "Temporary knee brace," she said. "Separate piece. You stake it to the ground here and pin it to the frame low, not high. It holds the frame while you work the permanent joints. You pull the stake when the wall is standing and can hold itself." Clara looked at the spot she was pointing to. It was obvious the moment she saw it. "My husband did it that way," Mrs. Peck said. She picked up her pencil and circled the corner with a single neat line. "First structure he ever built on this ground. 40 years ago come September." She slid the drawing back across the counter. "You're asking the questions that save lumber." Clara folded the plan along its original creases and tucked it into her apron pocket. She paid for the pound of cornmeal she'd come in needing anyway, and went out into the afternoon heat. The brace held on the third attempt. Clara felt it hold a different quality of resistance through the mallet handle, a density that said done rather than about to shift. The temporary stake was driven 18 inches into the ground, and the frame rose and settled plumb and stayed there while she worked the permanent joints from the bottom up, one at a time. When the last pin was set, she put both palms flat against the raw wood. The pine was warm from the afternoon sun. It smelled of resin and dry grass and the faint mineral sharpness of fresh-cut heartwood. She pressed her forehead against it and closed her eyes. The wood did not move. She was fitting the second corner post when the light from the north changed. She felt it before she registered what it was, the particular quality of shade that falls when something solid stands between open ground and the sun. She turned her head without lifting it. The same man, same fence post, same bay horse standing loose in the grass behind him. He was crouched at the base of the post with a tool in his hand, giving the work more concentration than it required. Clara straightened. She pushed the damp hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked at him directly. He didn't look up. She looked at the post. It was the same post she'd watched him work 2 days ago. Either it had a problem invisible from this distance, or the man was conducting the slowest fence repair in Kansas territory. She set the chisel back against her joint and struck it once, then again, from the fence line. One sound returned metal on wood, a single tap, then nothing. She didn't look back. When she finished the corner and straightened, both the man and the horse were gone. Nothing remained but the fence line, the flat grass, and the stillness a place holds just after it has stopped being occupied. That evening, Silas sat at his kitchen table with a cup of chicory coffee gone cold and looked at the framed photograph on the pine shelf above the stove. The small, oval one. He hadn't dusted it since before the ground thawed. He stood up. He took it down. He did not look at it. He laid it face down on the shelf with the backing board facing the room and stood there, with his hand still resting flat on it. Then he went to bed without lighting the lamp. He lay on his back and found the knot in the pine ceiling directly above the bed, the one he'd stared at through the worst of the bad months, the way a man fixes on a point when the rest of the room won't hold still. He had not looked at it in close to a year. He looked at it now, outside. Creed shifted once in the barn stall, a single movement in the hay, and then went quiet. The Kansas dark settled in with no wind and no sound in it. Silas didn't know why he'd put the photograph face down. He lay with that fact in the dark and turned it over without arriving anywhere. And after a long time, the ceiling was the same as it had been, and he was still there beneath it, awake, with the cold cup still on the table and the lamp still unlit. He thought about what he'd seen at the fence line. He thought about it for longer than he meant to. The rain came before dawn. Clara was awake when it started. She'd been awake for an hour already, lying on her side in the tent with the canvas pressing close and the air too still to explain why her eyes were open. Then the first drops hit the tent roof and she was on her feet before they became the second drops. She had 16 planks stacked outside, green pine, still taking on moisture, which meant they'd warp if they soaked through. She'd known rain was possible. She'd meant to cover them before dark. She hadn't. She pulled on her boots without unlacing them fully and went out into it. The rain was not a drizzle. It came down in the particular Kansas way, no warning, no gradual arrival, just the sky deciding it had been patient long enough. Her calico dress was soaked through before she reached the stack. She got her arms under the first 2 planks and ran them back to the tent and leaned them against the rear wall and went back for 2 more. She worked like that without stopping. 8 planks in, then 10. The ground had gone soft and her boots were pulling against the mud on every step. The wood smelled of pine resin and cold rain and turned earth. On the 12th plank, her left boot heel caught in a soft patch and she went down on one knee. The plank hit the ground. She got up, picked it up, kept moving. The last 4 planks were the long ones cut to the full span of the side wall. the ones she'd worried over since she bought them. She got her arms under the first and turned toward the tent and stopped. A man was standing at the fence line. The rain made him indistinct, a shape in the gray early light. He was on his side of the fence, and he was not moving toward her. He was standing there with something folded in his arms, dark canvas, and he was waiting. She stood in the rain, holding the long plank, and looked at him. He stepped to the fence post and set the bundle down on the ground on his side on the dry ground. She saw the post overhang, keeping the worst off it. Then he took one step back, folded his hands in front of him, waited. Clara looked at the bundle. She looked at him. She looked at the 4 planks still lying in the wet behind her. She carried the plank to the tent first. Then she walked to the fence, up close. The bundle was a tarp oil-treated canvas, folded tight. The kind that sheds water properly and keeps its shape. The man stood back at a distance that was deliberate, not crowding the fence, not on her side of it. His coat was soaked through, and his hat brim was dripping, and he had the look of a man who had been in worse weather than this and had stopped forming opinions about it. She put her hand on the top rail. "I'll bring it back when the wood's dry," she said. He nodded once. She picked up the tarp and carried it to her planks. The morning after came clear in the way that only follows overnight rain, the air scrubbed and the light heavier than usual. Everything set back to a clean start. Clara had the last plank dried and restacked before 8. She folded the tarp along its original creases, matched the corners the way she'd found them, and walked it to the fence line. He was there, not at the fence, but close to it, crouched at the same post he'd been working for days, doing something at the base in the damp earth. "Thank you for the tarp," Clara said. He stood. He was taller than she'd taken him for in the rain, the kind of tall that comes from years of outdoor work, not from any particular intention. "Ground dries fast out here," he said. "You'll likely need it again before you've got a roof on. I'll keep that in mind." She held the tarp out across the fence rail. He took it. His hands were the hands of a man who worked without gloves, by preference, the calluses set in the right places, a flat scar across the left thumb that had healed clean and stayed that way. He folded the tarp over his arm without looking at it. "The planks," he said. "Sill plate first, then studs." She hadn't expected that. "That's right. What are you setting the sill on? The ground you're building on has clay starting about 6 inches down. I've been running fence line next to this stretch 8 years. It moves when it gets wet, heaves a little, then settles." She looked at her section of ground. Flat stones, 6-inch clearance. North side runs lower. He looked past her at the grade. Rain pools there. I'd give it more clearance on that end. She turned and looked. He was right. She'd eyeballed the grade, but not tested it wet. And she could see now, with the overnight rain still sitting in the low spots, exactly where the water collected. "How long have you been watching?" she said. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved to the fence post, then back to her plot, then briefly, directly, to her face. Long enough to know that wood warps fast when it sits wet. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an explanation. It sat between them, and neither of them moved to clear it. "I've got a draw knife," he said. "Good for shaping doorposts. Green pine runs a crooked grain, cuts cleaner with the right tool than a saw does." Clara looked at the tarp in his arms. "I'll think on it," she said. She walked back to her plot. She did not look back at the fence. She picked up her mallet, found her place on the corner post, and went back to work. At 3 in the afternoon, she walked to the fence. The tarp was gone, the man was gone, but the draw knife was hanging from the fence post on a leather loop, the blade wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. She took it off the post and carried it to her work area. That evening, she sat in the tent, opening with the draw knife across her knees, running her thumb along the flat of the blade. The edge had been dressed recently. She could tell by the angle and the way it caught the fading light evenly, without pit or shadow. Both handles fitted tight to the tang, no looseness, no wobble. Someone had maintained this tool for a long time. She set it inside the tent, where the dew couldn't reach it, ate her supper, cold cornbread, water from the jug, the last of the dried apples she'd bought her second day in Harrow Creek, and looked at the north fence line in the last of the light. She'd saved 11 years for this land. 11 years of work in Ohio, first in her father's furniture shop, then in a hired room above a milliner's, sewing buttonholes for 6 cents per dozen. The deed had taken nearly everything she had left after the stage fair and the first supply run at Mrs. Peck's store. There was enough remaining for lumber and nails and food through summer if she didn't waste any of it. She did not think of this as frightening. She thought of it as arithmetic. She pulled the tent flap closed and trimmed the lamp low. Outside, somewhere past the fence line, a horse moved once in a barn stall and went quiet. She lay on her side and looked at the canvas wall and thought about a work table, which wall she'd set it against. Whether a south-facing window would give enough light for close work in the mornings. She hadn't let herself think about a window before tonight. She lay with it for a long while, working out the dimensions in the dark, before she finally slept. The next morning she found something else at the fence post beside the draw knife loop. A block and tackle rig, rigged and ready, the hemp rope coiled and the hook oiled. No note, no explanation. She stood looking at it in the early light. She hadn't mentioned the rafter work to anyone. The second wall frame was 11 feet long and built from the same green pine as the first. Clara had cut it the day before, measuring twice on each piece and once more after that, because green pine doesn't always behave like the pencil marks say it will. The joints were tight, the frame was square. She checked it with a length of string pulled corner to corner both ways, and the diagonals matched to within 1/8 of an inch. The problem was not the frame. The problem was that 11 feet of green pine framing weighs what it weighs, and there is no way to raise it plumb and hold it plumb and pin the temporary knee brace to it at the same time with one pair of hands. She had known this before she started cutting. She had told herself she'd work it out when she got there. She stood at one end of the frame and looked at it lying flat in the grass. The morning light was coming from the east, the way Silas had said it would. She still wasn't entirely sure what to do with the work table part. The way he'd said it, as though the table already existed and simply needed to be placed. She crouched and got her hands under the frame's top rail and lifted. The near end came up 4 feet before the far end torqued, and the whole frame shifted sideways. She set it back down before it went anywhere she couldn't control. She repositioned. Tried from the center, bearing the weight differently. The frame came up to vertical and stayed there for 3 seconds while she scrambled for the knee brace stake. And then it went past vertical because she couldn't hold it and reach the stake at the same time. She walked it back down to the ground before it fell. The sun moved. A meadowlark in the grass ran through its full call twice. Clara stood up straight, put both hands on the back of her neck, and looked at the frame. Boots in the grass. Not many steps. Then a hand went to the far end of the frame, and the frame came up. She didn't say anything. She got her hands back under her end and lifted, and they raised it together, the frame coming to vertical evenly this time. Nothing torquing. Weight shared across two pairs of hands, and she drove the knee brace stake, while Silas held his end plumb. 12 inches into the ground, the stake seated solid. She pinned the brace to the frame low, the way Mrs. Peck had shown her, and stepped back. The frame stood. She pulled the string and checked the diagonals, both within a 1/4 inch, close enough to build on. She looked at the frame standing in the Kansas morning. Then she looked at Silas, who was also looking at the frame. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. His hands went into his coat pockets. "You'd have gotten it." She wasn't certain that was true. She didn't say so. They worked through the morning without much talk. He seemed to understand or not need to be told which end to hold and when to hold it. She found, somewhere in the second hour, that she'd stopped watching to see if he was going to do something she hadn't asked for. He didn't. He did what the work required, and nothing past it. At midday, they sat on opposite sides of a stacked timber, 10 feet apart, both of them facing the same direction, the two frames now standing in the ground, joined at the corner, braced and plumb. Claremore had cold-out cornbread. Silas had something wrapped in a cloth that he ate without looking at it. The two frames made a shape, an actual shape, a corner, an angle, something that implied the rest of the room, even though the rest of the room was still air and Kansas grass. Clara ate and looked at it. "Opening faces east," Silas said, not to her. Exactly. He was looking at the frames, the way a man thinks out loud when he forgets he's not alone. "Light'll come in there every morning, depending on where you put your work table." She stopped chewing. He'd said it the same way as before. Work table. Like it was already a thing with a location. Not a thing she'd only let herself think about once. In the dark. After she'd been in Kansas long enough to believe the ground was actually hers. She swallowed. "South wall," she said. "East-facing window. That'll do it." She folded the cloth her cornbread had been in and set it on the timber. "I made furniture once. In Ohio." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. She picked up the cloth and folded it the other way. He didn't say anything for a moment. The meadowlark again, further off now. "Before you came out here?" he asked. "That's right." She left it there, and he left it there, and they sat with the space that two people keep when one of them has said something unplanned and the other one has decided not to make it a moment. Then she looked at the doorpost she'd been working on before the frame raising, the one where the grain ran at the wrong angle and kept grabbing on the draw knife no matter how she adjusted. 3 attempts, 3 uneven shavings. "This post," she said, "I think it's got a grudge." Silas looked at it. She saw his shoulders move one small, contained movement, and then a sound came out of him, a short thing, barely more than an exhale. But it was unmistakably a laugh. He stopped it the moment he heard himself. His right hand came up and touched his jaw, not rubbing it, just touching it briefly, the way a man reaches for something without knowing why, and then his hand dropped back to his knee and he looked at the post with an expression that had gone careful and level again. "Grain on green pine," he said. His voice was the same as before. "You run the blade with it and it bites. Run it slightly against. It slices clean." "Show me," she said. He stood and took the draw knife from the frame peg where it hung. He set the post across 2 stacked timbers, crouched over it, and made one pass with the blade at an angle she wouldn't have chosen, tilted maybe 15 degrees against the run of the grain. The shaving came off long and even, curling over the blade the way a good cut does. He set the knife down and stepped back. She took his place. She matched the angle as close as she could by eye, feeling for the resistance in the first inch until the blade stopped grabbing and started moving cleanly. The shaving came off, then another. She finished the post by mid-afternoon. He worked the second one while she moved to the east wall second course, and neither of them mentioned the laugh again, and neither of them needed to. The sun was dropping when they quit. Clara set down her mallet and stretched her back. Silas gathered his tools and tied them to the saddle. He'd left the block and tackle rigged to a peg on the corner frame since she'd taken it from the fence post that morning, and he checked the hook, now opened and closed it twice, and left it there without unhooking it. He untied Creed and checked the cinch without looking up. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "I'll have the third course cut by morning," Clara said. She heard him mount. She heard Creed's footsteps in the grass going north toward the fence line, and she listened without turning around until the sound was gone. When the plot went quiet, she noticed it was a different kind of quiet than the morning had been. She crouched at the base of the east wall frame and ran her palm along the bottom sill. The joint was solid. She pressed her hand flat against the wood and felt nothing shift. She straightened and looked at the shape the two frames made against the evening sky. Then she looked at the doorpost lying on the ground beside the frame, the second one. The one she hadn't fitted yet. The one still needing to be measured against the opening and cut to its final length. She picked it up, held it upright in the doorway opening, pressing the end flush against the sill plate, looked at where the top came to, 3 inches short of the header. She'd cut it wrong, and there wasn't enough remaining length on the piece to fix it. The doorpost problem had one solution, and it wasn't pretty. Clara found a short offcut in the stack 11 inches of straight-grained pine left over from the sill work, and spent the first hour of the morning cutting a scarf joint to join it to the short post. A scarf joint in a doorpost wasn't ideal. It would hold if she cut the angles clean, and pegged it through. She cut the angles clean. She pegged it through with 2 hardwood dowels, tapped home with the mallet, and set the whole thing aside to let the glue she'd boiled from the hide scraps dry before she trusted it with load. It would hold. It was not the post she'd planned on, but it would hold. She turned to the block and tackle. The rig had been hanging from the corner frame peg since yesterday, and overnight the snap hook at the top had seized closed on itself at a slight angle. The gate jammed. She'd oiled it and worked the mechanism back and forth until her hands smelled of linseed and rust, and the pulley wheel ran free enough, but the hook wouldn't open without a punch tool applied at the exact right point. She'd tried a nail, a piece of wire, the back edge of her folding knife. The hook stayed shut. It was Silas's rig. She needed to return it, and she needed to ask him about the hook. She took the draw knife down from the frame peg. She'd return both. She walked north to the fence gate, went through, and crossed the grass to the barn. The barn door stood open to the morning, not wide, just enough to let air through, the way you leave a door when you expect to be back within the hour. Clara stopped at the threshold and called in, "Mr. Wade." No answer. The interior was dim after the bright Kansas morning, and she waited at the door while her eyes adjusted. Creed was in the left stall, watching her with the level attention of a horse that has decided very few things are worth reacting to. The barn smelled of dry hay, horse, timber, and the faint mineral sharpness of well-kept iron. She called once more. Still nothing. She stepped inside and crossed to the workbench. The order in the barn was not the tidiness of a man expecting company. It was older than that, the deep-set order of someone who had put every tool back in exactly the same place. Every time, not enough that the positions had become permanent. Bridles on specific pegs, a hay fork with a wrapped handle leaning at the same angle it had probably kept for years, a row of cans above the workbench, each one labeled in block handwriting, each label facing out, everything maintained, none of it touched for pleasure. She found a free peg at the lower end of the row above the bench and crouched to hang the draw knife. As she crouched, she set the seized block and tackle on the bench surface and looked for the vise to hold it while she worked the hook. The vise was at the far end of the bench, near the corner. She picked up the rig and moved toward it. The rocking horse was on a low bracket beside the back wall, directly in her line of sight once she reached the bench's far end. It was not hidden. It was simply where it was set back from the main work area, in the way that things are placed when there is no longer a reason to move them. Oak, she thought. The body was shaped and sanded smooth, the grain coming up clear in the dim light. The legs were carved and pegged. The rockers were even and well balanced, but the neck ended in rough wood. Not rough from damage, rough from where the work had stopped. The chisel marks were still in it, the wood still blocky where a mane would have been carved. A small tack nail sat in the crest of the neck. Something had been meant to hang there. Nothing did. Beside the bracket, a pair of small boots on the shelf. The toe of the left one worn pale, the leather gone thin there. A folded wool blanket, green and brown plaid, set flat, with the careful flatness of something put away once and not touched since. Clara's hand came up and pressed against her collarbone. She stood like that for a moment. Then she set the block and tackle in the vise and reached for the punch tool on the rack above. And she was setting the punch against the jammed hook at the angle she thought it needed when she heard the change in the light behind her. Not footsteps. The shift in brightness from the door. The way the dim interior changed when something filled the opening. She straightened and turned before she heard him. Silas was standing inside the barn door. He had his work coat on and a tool in his hand. He'd been somewhere on the property, not far. His eyes found her first, then went past her to the workbench, to the block and tackle in the vise, and then to the corner. He read it in the way a man reads something he already knows the position of and doesn't need to examine. His face didn't change. It was already set in the arrangement it kept when he was working or alone, and he didn't alter it for her presence. He walked to the bench and set his tool down and looked at the seized hook in the vise. "Let me," he said. He took the punch from her hand, set the tip against the hook gate, at an angle she hadn't tried, lower than she'd gone, closer to the hinge point, and tapped it once with the bench mallet. The hook opened. He handed the rig back to her without comment. Then neither of them said anything for a moment. Creed shifted in the stall. Somewhere outside, a meadowlark started and stopped. Silas looked at the rocking horse. Not quickly, not reluctantly. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already had every conversation with, every kind of silence with, and is simply in the same room with now. "Never did finish the mane," he said. His voice was the same as when he talked about fence posts or grain angles. Level. The words had the compressed quality of something said many times in private, until the saying of them had worn smooth. He was quiet for a moment. "He'd have been 8, he said. "This spring." Clara stood with her hand at her side. The block and tackle hung from her fingers, and she let it hang there. "I'm sorry," she said, not carefully, not with the managed weight some people give those words, leaning into them as though sincerity needs force behind it. She said it the way she'd say anything that was simply true. Silas looked at her once, one full second, directly. Then he reached past her and took the draw knife from where she'd hung it and set it back on its peg at the correct angle and left it there. They walked out of the barn together into the full morning light. And the shift from the cool interior to the open air was physical temperature. Brightness. The Kansas sky, very large and very clear. Clara carried the block and tackle at her side. Silas walked with his hands in his coat pockets. At the fence gate, they stopped. "Third course today," Clara said. "I've got the timber cut." "I'll be there," he said. She went through the gate and walked back toward the cabin plot without looking back. She got the timber laid out and the measurements marked, and she was 3 lines into the cutting before she noticed that her grip on the saw had been steadier than usual all morning. No adjustment, no overcorrection, the blade tracking the pencil line without the small drift she'd been correcting for since the first day. She stopped and looked at the cut. Straight, both of them. Clean to the mark. She put the saw back to the wood and cut the 3rd line. Behind her, 50 yards north, she could hear the faint, steady sounds of a man working alone at a workbench. Small, rhythmic sounds. Patient and without hurry. The kind a person makes without thinking about it. She recognized the rhythm. She'd heard it in her father's shop for 20 years. In the particular way a man works when he expects to be at the same bench the next day and the day after that. She had not heard it since Ohio. She pressed the saw forward and kept her eye on the mark. When she reached for the measuring string to mark the 4th cut, her hand closed on nothing. She looked up. The string was still tied to the frame peg on the east wall, 30 feet behind her, where she'd left it before walking to the barn. She stood up and looked at the 3 cut ends. All 3 were a 1/4 inch long. She'd been measuring by eye, and her eye had been running the same small error each time, and she hadn't caught it, because she'd been listening to the sounds from the barn instead of watching her own hands. She started on the rafter work before Silas was likely to be at the fence line. That was the thought she did not examine too closely. She had the first rafter cut and carried to the frame before 6 o'clock, while the light was still low and flat and the dew was still on everything. The rafter itself was a good piece straight-grained, 18 feet, cut square at both ends. She'd chosen it from the stack specifically, running her hand down the length to find the one with the least crown. The problem was getting it up to the ridge. She'd thought through the process the night before, lying in the tent with the lamp out, working it step by step in the dark, the way she used to work through furniture joints, visualize the pieces, the order, the points of contact. She'd climb to the top plate using the frame as a ladder. She'd carry the rafter up on her shoulder. She'd set the bird's mouth notch at the wall plate, walk the ridge end up the pitch, seat it, simple in sequence, harder in execution. But she had done harder. She climbed the corner post using the frame studs as footholds, 8 feet to the top plate. She'd done this before, up and down, checking the work. The footholds were solid. At the top, she got one knee onto the plate and swung the other leg up and stood. And the frame held, and she was at 8 feet. The dew-wet rafter propped against the frame below her. She crouched down and got the rafter on her shoulder and straightened. The rafter's lower end swung and caught the frame, and she adjusted and found her balance. The weight distributed along her shoulder and the back of her neck. The way she'd calculated it would need to sit. Her left hand held the upper rail of the frame. Her right hand was under the rafter's midsection. Good. That was manageable. She stepped sideways along the top plate toward the ridge. One step. The plate was dry where she'd stood before the corner, had a slight overhang that kept the worst of the dew off. But the next sections of plate hadn't been stood on this morning, and the dew was full on it. A fine, cold film over the rough-cut surface. Her right boot came down on it and went sideways. Not far, maybe 2 inches. But the rafter moved with her and the weight transferred wrong, and she had one hand on the rail and one hand not free, and her left boot was on nothing, and then the rail was going away from her hand, and the rafter was coming off her shoulder, and there was the particular awful long second where the body understands what is happening before the mind has finished forming the thought. She went off the plate backward. The rafter went the other way. She hit the ground on her left side. In the ditch she dug 3 days ago, along the north wall, the drainage trench, a foot deep, packed at the bottom with the mixed mud and clay subsoil she'd turned out of the foundation cuts. The mud was black and cold, and her elbow went into it first, and then her hip, and then the side of her face, and the wind came out of her in a single hard compression, and then there was the sound of the rafter landing somewhere, a flat wooden crack, and then nothing. She lay in the mud and looked at the underside of the frame above her. Nothing was broken. She knew that almost immediately the landing had been wrong and hard, but the trench had been shallow, and the mud had taken the impact the way mud does, giving rather than holding. Her elbow was going to be bad by tomorrow. Her hip was already stiff with cold from the wet ground. The side of her face had mud on it from the ear to the chin. She did not move, not because she couldn't, because she was lying in a drainage ditch in 3 inches of black mud, with her face half buried in it. And she had been up here before light specifically, so that no one would be at the fence line to see this. And she could hear, from the direction of the rafter, a sound she couldn't immediately identify. She turned her head and looked. The rafter was on the ground 6 feet away, its lower end still resting against the frame base where it had caught on the way down. It was not split. It had landed across one of the stone foundation levelers, and the surface showed a fresh scrape, but the piece was still sound. She put her right hand into the mud and pushed herself to the sitting. The mud made a sound when she moved. It had worked into the collar of her dress and into the cuff of her left sleeve, and her hair on the left side was wet with it. She pressed the back of her wrist to the side of her face, and the wrist came away black. She was trying to get her left elbow under her to stand when she heard the hoofbeats. Not a full run, a fast trot. The kind a horse makes when it's been pushed from standing to moving quickly. Coming from the north. She got to her feet before Silas reached the fence line. She was standing when he came through the fence, not vaulting it, opening the gate she'd put in the third post for supply access, because he knew where the gate was and had known for a week. He covered the 30 yards at a pace that was not quite running, which was somehow worse than running. The deliberate fast walk of a man holding himself to something. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, her elbow, the mud on her dress, the entire left side of her, the rafter on the ground, the frame above. He read all of it in about 3 seconds, and she watched him do it. And there was nothing to do but stand in the black mud and be read. His hands came up and he checked her left arm first, running his fingers from the elbow down, not gently but carefully pressing at the joint, the forearm, checking the response. Her elbow was already tight and hot under his hand, and she kept her face level and did not make a sound. He pressed the joint directly and she pulled her arm back. "Not broken," she said. "No." he said. Bruised through. He looked at her face. He reached out and his thumb moved the mud away from just below her left ear. One stroke, to see the skin underneath. She stood still for it. His hands dropped. They were both looking at the rafter on the ground, at the fresh scrape on the surface, at the stone leveler that had saved it. The mud was cold on Clara's collar. She could feel it drying at the edge of her hairline on the left side, tightening as it dried the way mud does, pulling the skin slightly. Her dress was ruined. The calico was never going to come clean from this. The subsoil clay left a stain that washing didn't touch. I was about to come find you this morning, she said. He looked at her. About the rafter work, she said. I was going to ask you. His eyes moved to the fence line, then back to her face. I know, he said. I've been standing at that fence since sunup. The mud on her face was tightening. She could feel the exact outline of where it had pressed against the ground. Cheekbone, jaw, the edge of the ear. It mapped the shape of how she'd landed. She reached up and pressed her fingers against the mud along her jaw and looked at the ground and said nothing. I know, he said again, quieter, not repeating it for her benefit, saying it for himself, like a thing he was admitting to rather than explaining. She looked at her hands, mud in every line of both palms, mud in the crease of her knuckles, and in the calluses at the base of her fingers where the mallet handle had built them up. She'd been up before 6 o'clock specifically, so this would not happen. She looked at the frame, at the top plate, at the exact spot on the plate where the dew had been. The plate needs to be rough, she said, before I go back up. Yes, Silas said. She looked at him. He was looking at the plate, too, calculating. The mud on her face was still pulling as it dried, the clay tightening against her cheekbone. Then he said, There's something I need to show you first. 3 days after the fall, the top plate was still rough. Silas had taken a wood rasp to it. The same morning, both plates, the full length of each, working the surface down to a crosshatch pattern that would grip boot leather even when wet. Clara had watched him do it from the ground, standing with her left arm in the sling she'd made from a flour sack, not because it needed immobilizing, but because it needed to hang still for a few days, and she was not good at keeping things still. He hadn't asked her to step back. He hadn't told her what he was doing. He'd just gotten the rasp and done it. And when he finished, he ran his boot sole across the plate surface, once on each side, and then came back down. That was 3 days ago. The elbow had gone purple and then yellow, and this morning it was the particular greenish yellow of a bruise that has passed the worst and is now just finishing. She could grip the mallet handle. She'd tested it at first light, wrapping her fingers around the handle and squeezing until she felt the full shape of the pain, which was present but manageable, which was enough. She was at the frame by 6:30. Silas came through the gate at 7 with Creed and the block and tackle on the saddle. He'd replaced the snap hook. The whole fitting was new, a cleaner design, the gate opening wider. He didn't say where it had come from. He tied Creed to the gate post and carried the rig to the frame and handed Clara the plan she'd left rolled at the fence post the evening before. She'd marked the rafter positions, the ridge height, the angle of the bird's mouth cuts. She'd cut all 8 rafters over the past 3 days, working from the ground, one-armed, slower than she'd wanted, but they were cut and they were right. She'd checked each one twice. She unrolled the plan and they stood together at the base of the frame, and she showed him the sequence. He looked at it without touching the paper. Asked one question about the ridge board, whether she was using a structural ridge or a non-structural one. she told him. He nodded. They started. The block and tackle was rigged to the new hook in the ridge beam, and the first rafter went up on the rope, Clara guiding the lower end from the plate, Silas at the top controlling the pull. The rafters swung up, and she set the bird's mouth over the wall plate and held it while he came down and pinned the collar tie. One rafter, then the opposing one, then the next pair. They worked through the morning without stopping. Clara's elbow was a low, persistent heat by mid-morning, the kind that doesn't stop you but reminds you not to be careless. She was careful. She kept the sling in her apron pocket for the moments when her hands were both needed on the rope, and she put it back on during the minutes when Silas was working at the ridge alone and she could stand down. By 11 o'clock, 4 pairs were up. The ridge had a shape now, an actual pitched line against the sky, the geometry of a roof that would turn weather, that would hold snow if snow came. Clara stood on the rough, rasped plate at the east wall and looked at it, and felt the wood solid under her boots. She didn't hear the wagon. What she heard first was Mrs. Peck's voice not calling out, not announcing herself, just talking as she climbed down from the wagon seat, the way a woman talks when she's been carrying on a conversation in her head for the last mile and is simply continuing it aloud now that she's arrived. Never did understand why they build the ridge first when common sense says the rafters want to go in pairs from the center out. But I suppose there are as many ways to raise a roof as there are men who think they invented the method. Clara looked down from the plate. Mrs. Eugenia Peck was standing in the grass beside her wagon with a tin pie pan in both hands, looking up at the frame with the focused attention of someone conducting an inspection. She was wearing her good gray dress and her hat with the dark ribbon, which was what she wore to church and to any event she'd decided, unilaterally, was going to be worth getting dressed for. "Mrs. Peck," Clara said, "don't come down on my account." Mrs. Peck said. She looked at the pie pan, then at the nearest stump, and walked to the stump and set the pie on it with the same deliberate care she used on the store counter. "Dried apple. I had the apples." She pulled a low, 3-legged stool from the wagon bed and set it beside the stump, and sat down and took her knitting from her apron pocket. She looked at the frame once more, and then at Silas on the ridge, and then at her knitting, and that appeared to be all she had to say about it. Silas looked down from the ridge at Mrs. Peck. Mrs. Peck counted stitches. Clara looked at both of them and picked up her mallet and went back to work. The last 4 rafters went up in the early afternoon. The light was different by then, lower, more amber. The particular Kansas afternoon quality that makes the grain in cut wood stand out like the wood is lit from inside. Clara was on the plate for each pair, setting the bird's mouth, and her elbow had gone from a low heat to a medium one, and she kept her grip even and did not change anything about how she worked. The last rafter went into position at the ridge. Silas held it at the top. Clara had the nail set at the bird's mouth, the mallet in her right hand. He said nothing. He didn't hand the mallet to her, she already had it. He was holding the rafter from above, which was the job that needed doing, and she had the mallet and the nail, which were the tools that needed using. But she looked up at him. He looked back at her. Then he let go of the rafter with one hand and reached into his coat pocket and held out a nail, a longer one. A 40-penny spike she hadn't seen him pick up, the kind that would hold through a century of weather if you drove it right. She took it, set it at the joint, drove it. 1 stroke to seat it, 2 to set it, 3 to finish it. The spike went in clean. The rafter didn't move. She straightened on the plate and looked at the roof line. all 8 pairs, the ridge running the full length of the cabin, clean and straight against the sky, her ridge. She stood on the rasped plate and felt the wood under her boots and did not try to make it into anything other than what it was. Below, she heard the particular small sound of Mrs. Peck reaching the end of a row and turning her needles. "Well now," Mrs. Peck said. She wasn't looking at the knitting anymore. She was looking at the roof. She sat on her stool with her hands in her lap and looked at the whole thing, the walls, the ridge, the 8 pairs of rafters with the expression of a woman who has seen many things built and knows the difference between what gets built and what gets finished. "That's a fine house," Bacon said. She did not say cabin. She said house, with the full weight of the word, the way she would say it about any structure on the Kansas plain that had earned the name. No one corrected her. Silas came down from the ridge. Clara came down from the plate. Mrs. Peck cut 3 pieces of pie with the folding knife she kept in her apron and handed one to each of them on squares of brown paper. The apples were soft and sweet and had been spiced with something Clara couldn't name but recognized the particular smell of a kitchen that had been making the same pie for 30 years. They ate standing, the 3 of them, not in a line but in the rough triangle of people who have shared work and are now sharing the aftermath of it. Mrs. Peck talked about the Johnson family's new well 3 miles east. Silas said 2 words about the weather moving in from the northwest. Clara ate and looked at the roof. When Mrs. Peck climbed back onto the wagon, she gathered her reins and looked at the house once more. "You want to get the shingles on before that weather comes," she'd said. Not to Clara specifically, to both of them. And then she clucked to her horse and the wagon moved off down the track toward town, her knitting already back in her hands before the wheels had made a full turn. The sound of the wagon faded. Clara stood with the brown paper and the last of the pie and looked at the roof. Then she looked at Silas, who was looking at the roof too. "I don't have enough shingles," she said. She said it flat, no color in it, no distress, just the fact of it, which she had known since yesterday when she'd counted the bundle twice and come up short both times. Silas was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper and held it out to her. "I ordered more. 3 weeks ago. They came in at the freight office yesterday." She didn't take the paper immediately. She looked at him. "You ordered my shingles," she said. He didn't look away. "I ordered shingles," he said. "Figured somebody would need them." She looked at the paper in his hand. His hand was steady, but his jaw moved once. The way a jaw moves when a man is holding something back, not because he's ashamed of it, but because he is not yet sure whether it is safe to put it down. The last shingle went on the Tuesday after the weather came through. The weather had not been bad, 2 days of rain, steady and unhurried, the kind that soaks in rather than runs off. The roof had held. Clara had stood inside the walls, which had no door yet and no window glass yet, but had a roof, and listened to the rain on the cedar shingles and felt the particular quality of dry air that exists inside 4 walls when the wet is on the outside of them. That was the first time she had stood inside without needing to also be working. Just standing, just listening. The last shingle was a half-course piece at the eave line on the north side. She nailed it herself, from the ladder, while Silas held the base. When the nail was set, she climbed down, and they stood back and looked at the whole roof. Clean, even. The shingles had taken the rain and dried and gone the particular silver gray that cedar goes in the weather, which was not the bright new wood color she'd looked at in the bundle. but something older and more permanent. "That's done," she said. Silas picked up the ladder and carried it to the wall and leaned it there. "That's done," he agreed. He left at mid-afternoon. She swept the dirt floor still. Boards would come later with the straw broom she'd bought from Mrs. Peck the week before. She swept from the north wall to the south, working the dust out through the open door frame. And when the floor was as clean as a dirt floor gets, she stood the broom against the wall and looked at the room, 16 by 20 feet. The measurements she'd written in the margins of the plan back in Ohio, at that kitchen table, with a stub of pencil and the certainty that if she could only get the numbers right, everything else would follow. The walls were plumb, the corners were square. The light came through the east-facing window, opening no glass yet. Covered with oilcloth, tacked at the top and fell across the floor, in a shape that told her, better than any calculation, that the work table needed to go exactly there. South wall, 2 feet from the east window. That was where the light landed. She walked to the south wall and stood in the place where the table would go. She put her back to the wall and looked at the room from that position. The door opening was directly across, beyond it. The grass and the line of the fence and the sky above the fence, which was doing what Kansas sky does in late afternoon, going amber at the edges while staying clear blue at the top. The colors not transitioning so much as coexisting. She reached into the deep pocket of her dress and took out the land deed. She'd been carrying it there since she arrived. Not in the corset, not in a bag, not locked in a box in her pocket. The way you carry something you need to know is there. The paper had the soft texture of something that has been folded and folded again more times than it was designed to withstand. The creases were almost worn through at the intersections. She spread it flat against her thigh with both palms, and then carried it to the east window and set it on the sill. In the late light through the oilcloth, it looked like what it was, a piece of government paper, with a legal description and 2 signatures and a stamp. 160 acres. Her name written in the clerk's hand, straight and official, in ink that had gone brown. She smoothed one corner of it flat where it wanted to lift and stood back. She heard him at the door before she saw him. Not footsteps. She still didn't hear his footsteps. She'd noticed that about him weeks ago, the way he moved across ground without making the noise she expected. What she heard was the faint ceramic sound of 2 tin cups touching together, carried in the same hand. He was standing in the open door frame with his coat on and his hat in the same hand as the cups, the hat brim hooked over 2 fingers. He'd made coffee somewhere, his own place, she assumed, or the fire he sometimes built at the fence line when they worked late. The cups were steaming slightly. He looked at the room, at the clean floor, at the oilcloth on the east window. Still no door, he said. Clara looked at the open door frame, the squared pine edges, the evening light coming through it, and the grass beyond, and the fence line, and everything north of the fence that was his. "I can see who's coming," she said. He considered that. Then he held one of the cups out across the threshold. She walked to the door frame and took it. His fingers were warm from carrying both cups, and the heat came through the tin into her palm immediately. She wrapped both hands around it. He stepped through the frame into the room. He stood inside her house with his hat in one hand and his coffee in the other, and looked at the room the way he'd looked at the rafter plan, measuring, placing, understanding the logic of it. He looked at the south wall, at the east window, at the deed on the sill. He didn't say anything about the deed. They stood side by side in the room and drank their coffee and looked out through the open door frame at the field going dim. The coffee was stronger than she'd have made it herself. She drank it anyway. The bitter warmth went down and settled, and she felt it in her sternum. The specific weight of a hot drink in the body at the end of a day of work. Outside, a meadowlark called once from somewhere in the grass south of the cabin, and then went quiet. "What do you plant first?" Silas asked. He was looking out the door at the east wall of the cabin's exterior, not asking it as a question that needed deliberation, asking it the way you ask someone a thing you think they already know. "Sunflowers," she said. She didn't need to think about it. "Along the east wall, they'll turn their heads with the sun all day." She stopped. Then, "I want to watch something do that." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the east wall from the inside, seeing the outside of it in his mind the same way she was. "They'll be up by July," he said. "If you get them in the ground soon." "I know." She looked at the patch of floor where the work table would go. It was in shadow now, the afternoon light having moved, but she knew exactly where it was. He finished his coffee. He turned his hat in his hands once by the brim, something she'd seen him do before. The way some men turn a coin or close and open a clasp and then put it on. "I'll bring the door timber tomorrow," he said, "if you've got the hinges." "I've got the hinges," she said. "Been sitting in that bag since I bought them in town." He nodded, and he looked at the room one more time. She didn't watch him do it. She was looking at the deed on the windowsill, but she heard him looking. The way a room sounds different when someone is taking it in rather than just standing in it. Then his boots crossed the floor, and he went through the door frame and out into the evening. She listened to him go. The grass sound, the fence gate, Creed moving once in the barn north of the fence, that single soft movement that horses make when they hear someone they know coming back. Then nothing, just the meadow and the beginning of the dark. She set her empty cup on the floor and crossed to the east window and looked out. The window opening faced the fence line, and she could see it in the last light, the straight rail fence Silas had built or repaired. She didn't know which. Built so well you could tell from 100 yards that whoever put those posts in the ground expected them to be there past his own time. She looked north along the fence line until the dark took it. Then she sat down on the floor of her house with her back against the south wall, in the place where the work table would eventually stand. She reached for the cup she'd set on the floor and held it in both hands, even though it was empty and cooling. The tin was still warm enough. The oilcloth over the east window shifted once in a breath of air from outside. The land deed on the sill moved at its lifted corner and settled again. Outside the open doorframe, the sky was darkening at the bottom and still pale at the top, and the first stars were not stars yet, but suggestions of stars. The sky not dark enough to show them properly. She kept her eyes open. The lamp sat on the floor beside her unlit. She'd light it when she needed it. She didn't need it yet. She sat in her house in the last of the day's light and held the empty cup in both hands and looked at the door frame and the open evening and the beginning of the stars. And she didn't move, and she didn't reach for the lamp. And after a long time, the stars came out for real, and the lamp still sat unlit beside her. And she was still there. There is something quiet that stays with you after a story like this one. Not a conclusion. Just a feeling, the kind that sits in the chest the way a warm cup sits in both hands at the end of a long day. Tender in a way that doesn't ask to be explained. Familiar in a way that doesn't need a name. Many of us have carried something like what Clara carried. The particular weight of starting over in a place where nobody knows who you were before. The effort of building something with your own hands when stopping would have been so much easier. Some of us have been Silas standing at a fence line for reasons we couldn't quite say out loud, watching someone else do the hard thing and feeling something loosen in us that we hadn't known was still tied. It's all right not to know what to do with that feeling. It doesn't need to be figured out or resolved or set aside. It's allowed to rest right where it is. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. It mattered, having you here.